Imagine a day where children are guided and nurtured in a way that honors their unique humanness. A day where, instead of being expected to change in order to fit in, children can be met right where they're at. Welcome to Where They're Planted, a podcast for parents and care providers of unique children. Caring for a child with a developmental, emotional, or behavior challenge, a neurodiverse brain, or difficult early life experiences can be confusing and exhausting. On this podcast, we'll help your child flourish and strengthen their roots by helping you not only understand them, but also gain the skills to help them bloom where they're planted. We'll use brain science, nervous system tools, collaborative strategy sessions, and a deep understanding of the developmental process to create a fertile environment around your child in order to nurture their growth. I am your host, Jen Bluske, an occupational therapist with over 25 years of experience and a parent coach. My most closely held title, however, is that of a single mom of 2 thriving adopted kids, so I have walked this walk. I am truly excited to share, teach, and dive into these important topics on each episode. Welcome back to Where They're Planted. In this upcoming episode, we are going to continue our conversation around screens and electronics for our kids and ourselves. We wanted to take a little bit more time in this episode to have a conversation about our own relationships to our screens and how the beginning of change might be really focusing on our own relationship and ensuring that it is in line with what we strive for as humans, strive for as parents. And we hope to give a little bit more knowledge, a little bit more education around ways to just think about this topic a little bit different. In addition, we're going to keep digging deeper into developmentally how we can create shift and change for our kids in the area of electronics and screens. The goal of this podcast isn't to create any blame or shame. The goal of this podcast is, as always, to provide information so that you, as the parent, can make informed and intentional decisions around how you want screens and electronics to show up in your family. And so we are excited to dig back in today. Again, today I am joined by Meredith Wodrich. Meredith is a close colleague and co-conspirator in parent coaching at Children's Therapy Network and Thriving Parents Collective. She has a degree in art therapy, addiction counseling, and experiential education. She's worked with individuals, groups, and families as an art therapist, counselor, and supervisor in addiction mental health treatment for 30 years. Meredith raised 2 children as a single parent, one of whom is on the autism spectrum. Meredith is passionate about supporting personal growth and creative expression in others, and has a particular interest in supporting parents of children with unique needs. She believes in the importance of respecting children as whole human beings and the power of parental self-care in making positive impact on relationships with children. Welcome back, Meredith.
Thanks, Jen. Happy to be here again.
Yeah. So as we pick up on our second conversation around screens and how they're affecting our families and what we can do about it, I wanted to start by just thinking about some reflections. Parents' relationships with screens. If you listen to the last episode, we gave it as a little homework, a little wondering, a little curiosity last time. And so what are your thoughts on, as we dig into this, parents' relationships with their own screens and how it might be impacting our kids?
Yeah. Well, I kind of want to start with it's not your fault that you're looking at your phone all the time. Tech is designed to keep you on it. It really is. And we talked about that a little bit in the last episode, specifically regarding games. But algorithm and everything, they're all designed to be on it. And I'm finding that in my parent coaching, there's so many parents who talk about how they are aware that they lose themselves in screens, and that if somebody else picks up a phone, then they pick up their phone, that they're standing in line at the grocery store looking at their phone, that when they're feeling overstimulated by their kids, they lose themselves in their phone, that they're looking at their phone and checking emails and whatever, late at night before they go to bed. And so I really shouldn't be saying they. I should be saying we, because I absolutely am aware of doing the same thing. it's so pervasive, I think, that sometimes we don't even realize that we have our phone in our hand. It's very overwhelming.
So let's just sort of help parents dissect a little bit what that role of electronics might be in their own parenting. Like, how is it showing up as a tool or as a reward or as a part of the parenting process?
Yeah, yeah. I think there are two really key ways that electronics work for us as parents, and so we keep using them that way. And one is they are the perfect babysitter, right? Like when we need a break, when our kids need something to do, when they're agitated, if we're out in public, if we're on a long car ride, those are all times when giving your child a device makes a lot of sense and it works to keep them occupied, right? So that we can do other things or so that they can calm down. Mm-hmm. So that's a huge one right there. And then it's really easy for that to just sort of bleed into times when we don't actually really need to use it that way, right? It becomes a habit or whatever. Mm-hmm. Then the other thing that, and these two sort of feed each other, is that sometimes electronics feel like the only leverage parents have in terms of consequences and whatever. I've had so many families say to me, my kid doesn't care about anything but their iPad. Mm-hmm. And so I can consequence them with this or that, and it doesn't matter. So, I mean, we could have a whole nother conversation about what like boundaries and consequences actually really means. But the point is, like, the device is such a powerful thing that it's the thing that gets leveraged.
Yeah. So let's dissect it a little bit. In your first point, it was about, we might use it when we're traveling or whatever. I want to give some examples because I do think it's so integrated into our lives at this point that sometimes I think it's hard to even notice, maybe for families. Mm-hmm. And so I know one example I'm noticing a lot of the transition time is time sitting in the car. Mm-hmm. And so I'm noticing that for anybody who's not driving, and sometimes those who are driving, it's really hard, or it's really common that is just a time when a screen is on. Is that what you're seeing kind of in your practice as well?
Yes, absolutely. Basically, when there isn't something else really sort of demanding someone's attention. Like I also notice it in the grocery store. Kids sitting in the cart with an iPad, kid following behind mom looking at their phone. Now, if they were looking at their phone, you're like, here's the grocery list. Or like my son used to want to tally the cost of the groceries while we were going through the store. So then he's using his phone. But he also found many, many ways to be on the phone that I would be like, oh, that's a good reason. And then after a while, I realized you've been on your phone the entire day for lots of good reasons.
For a lot of good reasons, right? And I really think about developmentally, what are kids learning at a grocery store, for example, or, a convenience store or whatever, if they're not in the screen. And so, right, my OT brain turns back on of like, wow, this is how we scan our environment to find, our favorite cereal in the cereal aisle. This is how we problem solve to decide if we want a big box or a small box. This is how we look up at others and notice their facial expressions and decide if we're going to say hi or not. There's all of these things developmentally that are happening. And what else developmentally is happening for many of our kids at grocery stores is we're having tantrums, or we're having big feelings, or we're feeling bored, or we're, feeling overstimulated, or we're feeling frustrated because we can't have the sugary cereal or whatever it is. And developmentally, those things are all supposed to be happening because in 18 or 12 or 5 short years, we hope that our children are going to the grocery store independently themselves and have some learning around what that means and how to do it.
Yeah, and emotion regulation, I think, is one of the areas that is really dramatically impacted by too much screen time, especially passive screen time, where they're just sort of watching it and taking it in. And it's not demanding interaction from them or inviting interaction. I was thinking about this morning, how when you're just passively watching a show, you lose all awareness of your own body, of your own emotions. You're lost inside of the show itself. And so if a child is, 5 years old and emotional growth and regulation is a really key part of their development, and they're not in touch with their own body or their emotional self for extended periods of time, then when the screen is off, first of all, there's often such a big emotional reaction just to that. But then as they're interacting with other people, I think their emotions actually startle them. And this is something I saw a lot in addiction treatment when people were in early recovery. They had been masking their emotions with substance use for so long that when they had a rush of anger or the pull of disappointment, first of all, they didn't even know what it was. And these are adults. And second of all, they didn't know what to do with it. Right. And so it would come out in these really dysregulated, like sort of overblown ways. And I think we inadvertently deprive our children of the opportunity to practice knowing their own selves if too much time on screens.
Yeah, I really think about the developmental phases that kids are going through as it's impacted by screens. I think a piece is really learning developmentally what are kids supposed to be doing right now? And is the screen inhibiting it or not, right? Like, are we able to move in and out of the electronics in a way that still allows for that learning, the emotional learning, or how we transition, or how that might look for families. The other thing I really want to think about, and this is a little bit for our adults and for our kids, is what that additional time that we might have if we weren't on the screen,
Scrolling away.
scrolling away. I've personally been doing this myself as I've just been doing what I asked folks to do last time, just paying attention, not judging myself and not, whatever. But if you have an iPhone, it's right there. It's called screen time. It literally tells you what you've done in the day and the week. And, paying attention to that is powerful. Like, I had no idea I spent X amount of time on social media. In my mind, I wasn't on it at all during a day. Right. And I'm like, that was an hour and a half of time. I am so busy and there's so many things I want to do. I want to be outside and I want to be walking my dogs. And I want to do all this stuff. And like, I think I don't have time. And so let's talk about that a little bit.
That is a very real thing. And I even want to preface the comment by saying we live in an incredibly stressful society right now. And that is probably one of the number one complaints I hear from parents besides screens is like their personal lives are so stressful that they often experience parenting as a chore versus like the joy that they wanted parenting to be.
Right.
And so using screens as a stress relief and a break from other stimulation is a really natural response to the existence of screens. And so, like, I feel compassion for all of us around that particular thing. And when you think about the amount of time, I had a friend of mine say to me recently about screens, and she spends very little time on screens, which is really amazing. She got off social media and whatever in 2020 and has never gone back on. And I don't know how she does it. It's amazing to me. But she says it's an attention economy. The tech world literally makes money off of our attention.
Huh.
Who gets our attention? And so I think about people I know who have actually turned their screens off more than they ever had before. My sister-in-law did it. She just got off all social media and stopped turning to screens, stopped watching TV shows, and in 6 months she wrote a screenplay and started making a movie, which is what she does for a living. But like, she wrote the screenplay and had it ready to go in 6 months. A client that I worked with taught her 4-year-old and herself some German. They just taught it to themselves.
Wow.
And started learning to speak another language. Another one like started making art with her child, and then together they decorated their playroom with the art that they made. So it's amazing the amount of time, but it's not just the actual minutes. It's what happens to our mental space when we stop putting information in there and allow our brain to function on its own. Then we can access our creativity, our tools, right? When we're frustrated with our child or we want to redirect them or we want to teach them something, if we have a little bit of space in our brain, then we're able to remember what we want to do and calm ourselves and access our tools when it's hard to do that when it's already just sort of full and numbed by our screen time.
Yeah. It's so powerful. I heard a statistic. It's from Dr. K. I'll link it in the show notes that as we sleep, our dopamine builds up in our brain. So our dopamine is our attention. Our dopamine is our feel good. And so our first 4 hours of the morning are our most productive because we have just this like lovely, like full store of dopamine. And, productive meaning all of the different ways. And we know that screens not only give us dopamine, but it eats our dopamine, right? It's this dopamine like
Mhm.
cycle that we get stuck in. And so
Yeah.
the research is that if you get on your screen for the first 30 minutes of the morning, it eats that dopamine store and then it sort of makes you dopamine hungry for the rest of the day, as opposed to, being able to use that like juicy supply that we have to do the creative things or the deep thinking things or the more challenging things of our day,
Mhm.
when our brains are really ready for it. And so I really thought about that,
Mhm.
as I learned that statistic of like how many of us, our kids included, wake up and reach for our phones.
Right? And it's one thing to, like, have to look at the time because we all use our alarm on our phone, but, like, then can you put it down and not look at something else? Yeah, that's kind of like if you're diabetic and the first meal you eat in the day is really high carb or high sugar, you're gonna struggle with blood sugar levels all day long. I think that's fascinating. So it's just another way to relate to how, like, there's a physiological thing that's happening. It's not just our attention as this sort of vague, like, what is our attention? What is emotional regulation? It's actually our nervous system, our physiology of our body is responding to what we're doing with screens too.
Yeah, and we've talked about nervous system so much in this podcast, and I think that really shifting our nervous system with other tools other than the screens is something that is a resiliency factor that we need.
Mhm. Absolutely.
So, I want to shift the conversation now for those who have been listening and are like, "Oh, wow, either I already knew it was something I wanted to shift for myself and for my child, or now I really know it's something I want to shift for myself and my
Mhm.
child." And I do intentionally say myself and my child. I am saying that very intentionally
Yeah,
because, as in all of this parent work, we've
exactly.
got to shift it for ourselves if we're going to model it and shift it for our child. And so let's talk a little bit about how we create some change. Now, I'm going to also preface this by saying the things you learn on this podcast today are not going to magically shift everything with electronics in your home because it's deep and it's layered and it's individualized. And there are many, many, many patterns that most of our families really need to work through and make decisions around. But we wanted to start by giving some nuggets, some tools, some ideas that you can start with today. So, Meredith, what is the first thought if we're going to be creating some shift around electronics?
Yeah. So my first thought is how we even phrase this conversation. I like to say it in terms of starting places for changing your relationship with your child
Hmm.
around screens.
Okay, tell me more.
Not changing your child's relationship with screens, right? But
Yeah.
we're really focusing on the parent-child relationship and together how do we address screens? Because if you try to go directly to your child and their screen relationship, you're going to get a lot of resistance because there's such an intense bond, right, between the child and the screens because that's how they're designed, as we said. So just noticing that we're talking about connection with our child versus correcting their relationship with screens. And as with everything, like, can you increase your awareness around your own impulses with screens and screen use? So that is always the starting place. And I know as an adult myself, I'm just like, why is it always me? And as a mom, why is it always me? Because I'm the primary teacher.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the primary role model as a parent, right? And so, and children are always paying attention and listening to us. So there's that.
Let's give an example of that. Let's give an example of like what that might look like is to change the relationship with your child around the screen as opposed to
Mhm.
changing your child's relationship with the screen.
Yeah.
I mean, one that pops in my mind, I mean, this is just a simple one, but in my own parenting, my child often comes in rushes because they're a teenager to tell me the day's things, right? And so like I don't hear from them for, 48 hours and then suddenly they want to dump their entire week on me in 20 minutes. And what I've noticed is it's often at night. I'm often tired. I'm often wanting to shut down. I'm often on my screen. And what I've noticed is, oh, I need to actively show her that I'm setting my phone down and looking at her
Yep.
as a way to shift how we communicate with others and how we attune and attend away from the screen. So that's one example that pops up in my head is it's a small thing. It feels impossible to me, but it's a really huge message of how we engage.
Yes. It's very powerful. Yes, to set the phone down, especially face down. So now I can't even see, something pop up on the screen or even put it where I can't see the phone at all. That's a very dramatic and symbolic gesture. And you don't have to say a word. You just do it, right? And they're going to notice it because we've already talked about how you unconsciously, someone picks up their phone, you pick up yours, you don't even think about it. Another way, especially so you're talking about older children, is being really aware of the amount of intensity or frustration or pressure you feel as the parent towards your older child's screen relationship, right? Most of us are upset about it. And so we bring a lot of pressure to the conversation. And so being willing to switch that to curiosity, like just set the emergency intensity aside for a moment, which for me personally was very hard to do because I really did feel like it's an emergency. I like every time you're on your phone for an hour, setting that aside and getting curious, like what are you watching? What are you playing? Why do you like it? What are you getting out of it? Can you show me?
Right. Or show me how to use Snapchat. That's one I use. I don't know how to use Snapchat, but they do. Show me.
Right?
Yeah.
A lot of stuff happens on Snapchat, way more than I was ever aware
Yeah.
of. But exactly. So if you have a teenager who you've been, struggling with for a long time around their screen use, they're going to be suspicious of you when you first start.
Yeah.
And you might even struggle to be like, I'm like faking curiosity
Mhm.
because I can't really feel it because I'm still upset. But hang in there with it and like sit down next to them and like ask for permission to be shown. And as you do that, it just disperses some of the intensity that's between the parent and child. So, right, we're talking about the parent child relationship and how it connects to screens. And so that's one of the first things you can do is just start to get curious and really learn, like, what are they even into and why is it meaningful to them? Because that information is going to be really helpful when you get to the point where you're actually trying to change the behavior together with your child, because that's ultimately what you're going to want, is that the two of you together or the three of you together, depending on who all is involved, both parents, whatever, you're going to want to address the relationship with screens together.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So that would be one thing, like in terms of teenagers. If it's younger kids, I would consider just adding more non-screen time activity whenever possible, suggesting something. Even with, so my son on the autism spectrum, his thing, and like this is the early 2000s, so, it was a very different world with screens back then. But he was like Mr. Research. So he just looked up everything on his phone. And so I got to the point where I'd ask him, hey, before you Google it, let's see if you can guess what Google might tell you. So I'd at least be encouraging his brain to think about and do the problem solving before he just inputted information, right? And of course, because he was bright and he had this like Mr. Exacto, I know everything kind of approach to life, it was really fun for him to see, did I guess what Google would say? The one other thing I was thinking about is parents can begin to pay attention to when their child is doing something that's interactive on a screen. They're playing a game that requires, like, is it Minecraft and probably Roblox too, though I don't actually know that game, where they're actually building whole entire worlds and stuff. So they have to do a lot of cognitive work in order to do that. And sometimes they have other kids playing with them. That's different than just passively watching, watching other people play the games or passively watching something where they're minimally interacting. So if you start to notice, which one your child is doing, then there's an intervention place for you later down the line, right? Where you would minimize the passive stuff.
Yep. Absolutely. I think that that's huge. And then, I think for our little ones, leaving the house and forgetting the electronics is powerful, right? For us all. Go for a walk without the screen. Go for, a drive without the screen. I mean, the little ones, they just want to engage with their parents, right? Turn on the music, be silly together. I think that the power of that in supporting creativity and creating connection can't be underscored enough.
Yeah, exactly. As I was doing some of the research for this whole topic, which I've been obsessed with since my children were young, I was shocked to see that there was any kind of recommendation at all from the American Academy of Pediatrics around screen time for kids. So 18 months and younger, they're saying, if you're in a FaceTime family, that's one thing, but otherwise there should be no screens at all. And then after that, it's like no more than an hour a day. And I'm thinking, just postpone it as long as you possibly can.
Yeah.
Just keep pushing it back, pushing it back, pushing it back. It's one thing to watch, an hour of Sesame Street or some PBS show or whatever, or it's like totally a kid's show, Blue's Clues. I'm totally dating myself by naming stuff. I have no idea if it's even around anymore. Where they're doing some like learning and interactive, but really minimize that as much as possible so that you don't end up with a 7-year-old who is having huge meltdowns because you've taken away their iPad because they've already gotten so attached to it. So that's your best opportunity, is when the kids are young and you just keep turning off the screens, put your phone away, and get out and live life.
Absolutely. The other thing that I wanted families to think about today as far as strategy is, I am a huge proponent of using the apps, the external apps that monitor, or you can actively limit screen time based on, hours of the day, or based on times of the day, or based on which apps. Or there are quite a few good ones out there that take sort of some of the initial boundary off of you as the parent and putting it on the app. I know that so many of my parents, say, I intend to have the phones out of the room by 9 p.m., but then I'm tired and I forget. And right, that's real. Let an app do that. I mean, that's not something that we have to have one more thing to remember to do. And so that's one of the simpler ways that I like to think about starting to create some of the boundaries around screens for our kids.
Yeah, I'm glad you said boundaries, because that's such a, well, it's a really important and kind of exhausting topic for a lot of us parents, being able to hold a boundary, asserting a boundary in a way that's not coming across like I'm a dictator, right? Or like being too waffly with our boundaries. And boundaries around screens is such a big deal. It becomes so contentious between kids and their parents that when you use the app, that's a great deflection away from like, I'm not the one coming in and making you feel bad that you have to turn this off. The app is doing it, so they can aim it at that. I think that's really important. And the conversation about boundaries is just so complex that pairing that with relationships with our children and electronics has really inspired me to put together a webinar on the topic where we can do a deeper dive in a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about in these last 2 podcasts. So that's something to kind of keep an eye out for. I'm working on that right now and really excited to do that because, like I said, I've been really passionate about this topic, since my kids were little, and my kids are in their late 20s now. So it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, I'm so excited to hear that. I'm so excited to let families know that, we today, or in the last 2 episodes, we're giving you just a little bitty nugget, right? Of, thinking about screens and thinking about electronics in a different way. And we are very excited for Meredith's webinar that will have much, much more specifics, much more individualized supports, the ability to dig just a little bit deeper into this if it's something that you're really hoping to change for your kids.
Yeah. Empower parents to do something different, more in line with their values,
Absolutely. I do think we'll leave it there today. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Happy to be here again. Thanks, Jen.
Hello, Where They're Planted listeners. I wanted to pop on here and remind you of our Thriving Parents Collective online courses. If you like what you hear on this podcast and are seeking more, check out this resource. This course offers you over 9 educational videos and 50 pages of self-reflective workbook in order to guide you through the process of integrating connected parenting strategies into your day-to-day life. Listen when it's convenient for you and use the content as the foundation for a shared language between you and your partner, or family members. In addition, access one-to-one sessions with a parent coach to support individualized strategies to help you meet your child right where they're planted. For listeners, access this course for $99 by using the code THRIVING at the checkout. We look forward to having you join our Thriving Parents Collective. Where They're Planted is a Lit Path Studios podcast and is produced by Jamie Gale and Jen Bluske. Music is by Gaston Reen and Pod 5. Thank you for loving your child right where they're planted.